I want to read some of the things that have been said about you, give you a chance to respond. Christian nationalist, wrecking ball, holy warrior, dangerous, grim reaper, and powerful. How would you describe yourself?
Look,
would you pick any of those?
The beauty of doing the job for the second time is you've gotten a chance to think about it for 4 years. And that is something that the president, I think you are seeing at a national, global level of a president that got a chance to do this job again. And I've been thinking about it for 4 years. And there were lessons learned, but there was also theses that became conclusions. And so we have tried to think ahead, to put a team in place to be able to deliver for the president. And we're excited about what we're able to accomplish right now. And, you know, I largely don't pay attention to anything that's being said.
You just witnessed something chilling, and you better buckle the hell up, because what we're seeing here isn't just garden-variety political doublespeak, or your run-of-the-mill Washington bureaucrat artfully dodging tough questions about controversial positions. No. What you just watched is something far more sinister and vastly more consequential for the future of American democracy and secular governance, and you need to understand right now that this isn't hyperbole or progressive overreach, or some kind of hysterical left-wing panic attack about conservative values in the public square. Russell Vought openly describes himself as a Christian nationalist and has summed up his core political ideology as Christian nationalism, and when an interviewer confronts him with labels that should make any defender of pluralistic democracy recoil in horror, labels like Christian nationalist and holy warrior and dangerous and grim reaper, this man doesn't flinch, he doesn't deny, he doesn't equivocate. He simply shrugs and tells you he doesn't pay attention to criticism because he's too busy executing the vision, too busy delivering for the president, too focused on implementing the plans they spent 4 years meticulously crafting while the rest of us hoped American institutions would hold. And here's the bombshell that should terrify every single person who values the separation of church and state and the fundamental pluralism that has defined American democracy since its inception. Vought's Center for Renewing America drafted over 350 executive orders, regulations, and memos for the second Trump administration, describing his work as creating shadow agencies that operated in deliberate secrecy while Democrats and even moderate Republicans were busy debating policy details and electoral strategy. This is not normal conservative governance. This is not even the Reagan-era fusionism that sought to blend free market ideology with social conservatism. This is a comprehensive blueprint for theocratic capture of the federal government, authored by a man who wants bureaucrats to be traumatically affected and says we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains, and explicitly states we want to put them in trauma as a governing philosophy. Let that sink in for a moment, because the next bombshell is even more explosive and connects directly to the authoritarian playbook we've seen deployed in Hungary and Poland and Turkey and every other nation where democratic backsliding accelerates under the guise of restoring traditional values. Vought supervised Project 2025's second phase called the 180-Day Playbook, a concrete transition plan for each federal agency, with confidential plans kept secretive to avoid the press and the Freedom of Information Act, which means they knew damn well that sunshine would kill this thing, that transparency would expose the anti-democratic nature of their ambitions, that the American people, if given full information about what Christian nationalism actually means in practice, would reject it overwhelmingly. In 2024, 53% of Republicans qualify as either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, compared with 22% of independents and 16% of Democrats, with 37% of those in red states qualifying as either adherents or sympathizers, which tells you this is a minority movement even within conservative America, but it's a minority movement that has successfully captured the Republican Party apparatus and now controls the executive branch with a detailed implementation strategy. The intellectual genealogy here matters enormously, because you need to understand how we arrived at this moment, when a top-budget official can casually dismiss being called a Christian nationalist at a Reagan Library forum of all places, and the answer lies in decades of right-wing institution building that has now metastasized into something the old fusionist conservatives never intended, or perhaps always intended, but kept cloaked in more palatable rhetoric about family values and religious liberty. Vought has pledged fealty to a vision described as equal parts Cotton Mather and Roy Cohn, which captures perfectly the toxic marriage of the theocratic zealotry and ruthless political prosecution that defines this movement, and when you watch him in that clip treating alarmed criticism as background noise beneath his notice, When you hear him talk about lessons learned and hypotheses that became conclusions, and putting a team in place to deliver, what he's really saying is that they've studied the failures of the first Trump term and identified the career civil servants and institutional guardrails and democratic norms that prevented full implementation of their vision, and now they're systematically dismantling every obstacle. Here comes another bombshell that directly connects Vaught's Christian nationalist ideology to concrete policy outcomes that harm real people and assault fundamental rights. Vaught's influence can be seen in Project 2025's proposals that say policies supporting LGBTQ+ rights, subsidizing single motherhood, and penalizing marriage should be repealed because gender identity threatens fundamental liberties, and it proposes increasing surveillance of abortion and maternal mortality reporting, compelling the FDA to revoke approval of chemical abortion drugs, and protecting religious and moral objections for employers who decline contraception coverage. This isn't about protecting religious liberty for individual believers to practice their faith as they see fit. This is about imposing a specific fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity on the entire nation through the coercive power of the state. And when Vought sits there smugly explaining that he largely doesn't pay attention to what's being said about him, he's performing the authoritarian's contempt for democratic accountability, signaling to his base that criticism from pluralists and secularists and progressive Christians, and anyone who believes in the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, is simply irrelevant to the project of remaking America as a confessional Christian state. The historical parallels are both instructive and terrifying if you know anything about how democracies die and how theocratic movements consolidate power once they capture state institutions. Vought has compared 2024 to 1776 and 1860 for the complexity and the uncertainty of the forces arrayed against us, citing the years when the colonies declared independence and the first state seceded over Lincoln's elections, which is apocalyptic framing that positions democratic opposition not as legitimate political disagreement within a pluralistic system, but as existential threat requiring extraordinary measures. And this kind of rhetoric has always preceded democratic collapse because it creates permission structures for violation of norms and laws and constitutional constraints in the name of saving the nation from internal enemies. Vought isn't some backbench ideologue publishing manifestos on obscure websites. He is one of 2 or 3 most influential players in the current administration, behind only Trump and arguably Stephen Miller. Every penny appropriated by Congress passes through OMB. It reviews all significant regulations proposed by federal agencies, vets executive orders before the president signs them, and issues workplace policies for more than 2 million federal employees, which means this Christian nationalist true believer now controls the choke points through which American governance flows. And now the bombshell that should galvanize every defender of secular democracy into immediate action because time is running out to prevent the full implementation of this theocratic agenda. Trump posted an AI-generated video parody starring Vought as the scythe-wielding Grim Reaper, with lyrics declaring Russ Vought is the Reaper. He wields the pen, the funds, and the brain, and in October 2025, Vought announced the RIF's reductions in force have begun, referring to federal worker layoffs confirmed to be substantial and permanent. The President of the United States is celebrating his budget director as the Grim Reaper. They're not even pretending this is about efficiency or fiscal responsibility or draining the swamp of corruption. They're openly declaring their intention to destroy the administrative state, and they're using apocalyptic religious imagery to do it. And you better believe that when Vought talks about infusing government and society with Christianity, he means exactly what he says, because he wishes to infuse government and society with elements of Christianity, and wrote in 2022, that he commits to institutional separation between church and state, while simultaneously advocating for integration of Christian influence with government and society, which is Orwellian doublespeak that means we'll maintain the rhetorical shell of separation while gutting its substance. The clip you just watched captures something essential about how authoritarianism sells itself in late-stage democracies, where outright coups are too costly and old-fashioned fascist aesthetics have been discredited. Vought doesn't storm onto the stage in jackboots and armbands. He doesn't denounce democracy in crude terms that would alarm moderate voters. He doesn't even need to defend Christian nationalism, because he's already moved past the debate about whether it's acceptable and into the operational phase of implementation. And that's what makes his casual dismissal of criticism so chilling. When the interviewer lists those damning labels, Christian nationalist and wrecking ball, and holy warrior, and dangerous and grim reaper, Vaught's response is essentially to say none of that matters because we have power, and we have plans, and we have a team, and we're executing right now. And this is the logic of every revolutionary vanguard that has ever captured state power and used it to remake society according to ideological blueprints developed during years in the wilderness. The Supreme Court has already been captured by this movement and is systematically dismantling the separation of church and state in case after case, with an Alabama judge explicitly invoking the wrath of a holy God in his court ruling that frozen embryos are people, and House Speaker Mike Johnson displaying an Appeal to Heaven flag outside his office on Capitol Hill, which is a Christian nationalist symbol that appeared at the January 6th insurrection. And what we're witnessing is the coordination of all three branches of government, plus right-wing media, plus Heritage Foundation, and other institutional infrastructure, plus megachurch networks, all working in concert to achieve what they call the restoration of America's Christian foundation, but what is actually the establishment of something that has never existed in American history, a nation where one particular expression of Christianity enjoys state enforcement and protection, while all other belief systems, including other forms of Christianity, are relegated to second-class status. Here's where the analysis needs to get even sharper, because there's a class dimension to this Christian nationalist project that often gets obscured by the focus on culture war symbolism and religious rhetoric. Vaught's involvement with the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 should be viewed as fulfillment of pre-Trump conservatism, with its desire to smash the administrative state, and what that means in practice is deregulation that benefits corporate power, dismantling of worker protections and environmental safeguards and consumer rights, privatization of public goods, and massive upward redistribution of wealth and power, all wrapped in the sanctifying language of returning America to its Christian roots and protecting religious liberty from secular tyranny. During Trump's first term, Vought helped the president use taxpayer dollars allocated to the Defense Department to build portions of the border wall and helped illegally freeze security assistance for Ukraine, while Trump pressured Zelensky to investigate Biden, leading to Trump's first impeachment, which demonstrates that this isn't just about prayer in schools or 10 Commandments in courtrooms. This is about a comprehensive assault on democratic accountability and the rule of law, using Christian nationalism as the ideological justification. The connection between Christian nationalism and support for political violence cannot be ignored, because it's central to understanding why this movement poses an existential threat to American democracy. Nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents and nearly 3 in 10 sympathizers agree that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country, compared with only 15% of skeptics and 7% of reject Bert, and this is why January 6th wasn't an aberration, but a preview of what happens when you combine apocalyptic religious ideology with authoritarian political theology, with a cult of personality around a strongman leader who promises to restore the nation to its imagined Christian golden age. 2/3 of Christian nationalism adherents and nearly half of sympathizers agree that God ordained Trump to be the winner of the presidential election, which means for these true believers, any opposition to Trump is opposition to God's will, and can therefore be met with righteous violence if necessary. The demographic and geographic dimensions of Christian nationalism's spread reveal that this isn't just fringe extremism confined to rural backwaters, although in states including North Dakota, Mississippi, Alabama, and West Virginia, half or nearly half of residents support the view that Christians should dominate all areas of American society, including its laws, but the movement has also successfully penetrated Hispanic Protestant communities and has grown its influence among younger evangelicals who have been raised in churches teaching Seven Mountains dominionism and other theocratic doctrines. The ideology of Christian nationalism is moving beyond its traditional enclave of white conservative Christians, and a multiracial coalition based on theocratic supremacy is a clear and present danger to a multicultural pluralistic democratic society, which means the old playbook of assuming demographic change would inevitably weaken white Christian nationalism is inadequate, because the movement has proven adaptive and is successfully recruiting adherents across racial and ethnic lines through shared theological frameworks. Now, here's where we need to understand the sophistication of what Vought and his allies have built, because they learned from the failures of previous conservative movements that lacked the infrastructure and personnel and detailed policy knowledge to transform electoral victories into permanent institutional change. Vought served as Trump's director of OMB and has served by some accounts as the lead administrator of the Project 2025 initiative, overseeing 1,000 employees and 30 separate task groups under its aegis, which represents an unprecedented level of preparation and coordination for a second term. And when you combine this with Vaught's statement that the president is not bound by the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents federal troops from conducting civilian law enforcement, you begin to see the outlines of an authoritarian state apparatus that would use military force domestically, gut the civil service, pack agencies with ideological loyalists, and systematically dismantle every institution that could resist the imposition of Christian nationalist governance. The Reagan library setting for this interview adds a layer of bitter irony, because while Reagan certainly courted the religious right and used culture war rhetoric to build his coalition, there was at least nominal adherence to pluralistic norms and constitutional constraints, and the understanding that you couldn't simply impose sectarian religious doctrine through state power without violating fundamental American principles. What Vought represents is the abandonment of even that fig leaf of restraint, the emergence of a Christian nationalist vanguard that views Reagan-era conservatism as inadequate because it failed to achieve full dominion over American society and culture. Vaught's Newsweek column endorsed an orientation for engaging in the public square that recognizes America as a Christian nation, where our rights and duties are understood to come from God, with institutional separation between church and state, but not the separation of Christianity from its influence on government and society, which is sophisticated language that obscures a radical agenda to overturn 2 centuries of First Amendment jurisprudence and establishment of secular government. The pathology of this movement becomes even clearer when you understand how it mobilizes fears about demographic change and cultural transformation and loss of white Christian dominance into political support for authoritarian measures. Christian nationalist ideology is correlated strongly with the perception, especially among white Americans, that immigrants are invading American society and replacing ethnic and cultural heritage, and 68% of Christian nationalism adherents agreed that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, which connects Christian nationalism directly to Great Replacement conspiracy theories and white nationalist ideology, despite protestations that this is simply about preserving Judeo-Christian values. Christian nationalism is strongly associated with fears about ethno-racial purity, persecution, perceived loss of individual autonomy, and beliefs in ethnic or religious conspiracy theories, and experimental research shows that Americans primed to feel racial or religious threat tend to respond by embracing Christian nationalism and supporting Trump, which means the movement's growth is driven not by genuine theological conviction or sincere belief in Christian principles of mercy and justice, but by atavistic fears of losing dominant status in an increasingly pluralistic and multiracial democracy. The media's general failure to adequately sound the alarm about Christian nationalism represents a catastrophic abdication of responsibility in the face of an existential threat to democratic governance. Too many journalists still treat this as just another political story, just another example of polarization and partisan disagreement, when what we're actually witnessing is a systematic attempt to overthrow secular constitutional democracy and replace it with theocratic authoritarianism. And the fact that Vought can sit there at a Reagan library forum and casually dismiss concerns about Christian nationalism without facing sustained challenge reveals how normalized this extremism has become in Republican circles. Trump's true sin is not hypocrisy, but theocracy, and Christian nationalism is an extremist ideology at odds with the fundamental pluralism of American life, posing a threat not just to secular people, but to the vast majority of religious people whose faith does not entail using the state to impose theology, which means resistance to this movement must include coalition building with Christians who reject dominionism and understand that religious freedom requires government neutrality toward religion. The economic agenda concealed within Christian nationalist rhetoric deserves much more scrutiny, because while they're talking about restoring Christian values and protecting religious liberty from woke persecution, they're actually implementing policies that devastate working people and concentrate wealth and power in corporate hands. A former Trump official said Vought would take dream budgets to Trump proposing cuts to social programs and entitlements, and Trump would say he didn't want those cuts, and Vought would back down, which would drive Vought crazy because he wanted to make actual cuts. And this reveals the tension between Trump's populist instincts and the Heritage Foundation Republican establishment that Vought represents. But in the second term, without electoral concerns, and with Vought now controlling OMB, those cuts are being implemented over massive resistance. The Christian nationalist framing allows them to gut the social safety net and eliminate regulatory protections while claiming they're engaged in spiritual warfare against secular tyranny rather than class warfare on behalf of the wealthy. The international dimensions of rising Christian nationalism and religious authoritarianism suggest this is part of a global movement toward illiberal democracy and theocratic governance that's gaining strength across multiple continents. Christian nationalism seeks to establish a country governed by a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, and adherents and allies of the movement have aligned themselves with Donald Trump and the Republican Party, but this alignment isn't unique to America, because we're seeing similar fusions of religious nationalism and authoritarian politics in India with Hindu nationalism, in Russia with Orthodox Christianity, in Turkey with Islamic nationalism, in Poland and Hungary with Catholic nationalism, and these movements study each other and learn from each other and coordinate with each other through international networks of religious conservatives who view secular liberal democracy as their common enemy. The stakes here are genuinely civilizational, because if Christian nationalism succeeds in capturing and transforming American democracy, it will embolden similar movements worldwide and potentially trigger a cascade of democratic collapse. What's needed now is a level of mobilization and resistance that matches the scale and sophistication of the Christian nationalist assault on democratic institutions, and that means moving beyond conventional political strategies, focused on winning elections and passing legislation, because Vought and his allies have built infrastructure specifically designed to survive and operate through electoral defeats and congressional opposition. Vought founded the Center for Renewing America with a mission to put God, country, and community at the center of policy debate. And at an invitation-only 2023 meeting, he said, "We want bureaucrats to be traumatically affected, and when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work, and we want to put them in trauma," which is the language of psychological warfare against your own government employees. And it signals that this is a movement that understands power operates through multiple vectors, including cultural institutions and media infrastructure, and legal frameworks and bureaucratic processes, not just electoral majorities. The clip we're analyzing reveals something crucial about authoritarian psychology and how movements consolidate power through what theorists call authoritarian confidence, which is the public performance of certainty and dismissal of opposition that signals to both supporters and opponents that resistance is futile because the outcome is predetermined. When Vought says he doesn't pay attention to criticism and instead focuses on executing the plan they spent 4 years developing, when he talks about putting a team in place and delivering for the president with that little smirk suggesting he knows something you don't, he's performing dominance and inevitability, trying to demoralize opposition by making it seem like Christian nationalism's triumph is already accomplished and you might as well accept it. This is psychological warfare, and it only works if we accept the framing, if we treat their confidence as justified, rather than as bluster covering for the fact that they're still a minority movement imposing an unpopular agenda through institutional capture, rather than democratic persuasion. The roadmap forward requires understanding that defeating Christian nationalism isn't primarily about winning arguments or fact-checking their historical claims about America's founding or debunking their theological interpretations, although all of that matters. What's required is political hardball that matches their institutional sophistication with progressive institution building, that matches their 4-year preparation with our own comprehensive strategy for not just resisting, but dismantling the infrastructure they've built, that matches their willingness to push constitutional boundaries with our willingness to use every available lever of power when we hold it. That means court reform to break the Christian nationalist stranglehold on the judiciary, aggressive investigation and prosecution of officials who violate the law in service of this agenda, protection and empowerment of civil servants who resist illegal orders, support for states and localities that refuse to implement Christian nationalist policies, international coalition building with democratic movements facing similar threats, sustained mobilization of the secular and pluralist majority that exists in this country but often remains politically disorganized. The moral urgency here cannot be overstated because what we're witnessing, nothing less than an attempt to fundamentally transform the United States from a pluralistic constitutional democracy where government remains neutral on matters of religion into a confessional Christian state where one particular expression of Christianity enjoys state sanction and enforcement. This isn't alarmism or progressive hysteria. This is what Vought and his allies openly advocate when they think cameras aren't rolling, and sometimes even when cameras are rolling, as we just saw. And the fact that they've now captured the Republican Party and control significant portions of the federal government means the threat is immediate and existential. Every day that passes without sustained resistance is another day they use to implement their blueprint, to replace professional civil servants with ideological loyalists, to establish precedents that will be difficult to reverse, to reshape the judiciary in ways that will endure for generations, to embed Christian nationalist principles into the operations of government, so deeply that removing them will require extraordinary political will and sustained majoritarian commitment. The clip ends with Vought cutting himself off and saying he largely doesn't pay attention to what's being said about him, and that truncated sentence sitting there unfinished perfectly captures the Christian nationalist movement's contempt for democratic accountability and pluralist discourse. They don't care what critics say because they've moved beyond the realm where criticism matters. They're not trying to persuade anyone or win debates or operate within the norms of democratic deliberation. They're simply executing the plan they developed in secret over 4 years, and they're confident that by the time people fully understand what's happening, it will be too late to reverse. That's why the interviewer's question listing all those labels was the wrong question, because it accepted the premise that Vought would care about being called a Christian nationalist or a wrecking ball or dangerous, when the entire point of his performance is to signal that he doesn't care, that criticism is powerless, that the transformation is already underway. The right question is not how would you describe yourself, but how do you respond to the charge that you're systematically dismantling democratic governance and secular constitutional principles, and even that question probably wouldn't penetrate because Vought would simply say yes. That's exactly what we're doing, because American governance and secular principles are corrupt and ungodly and need to be replaced. This is the fight of our lives, and it requires absolute moral clarity about what's at stake, which is nothing less than the survival of pluralistic democracy and secular governance and religious freedom for all, including religious freedom for Christians who reject the dominionist theology that animates Christian nationalism. Christian leaders have united to denounce Trump's administration with a letter stating, "Far from Trump as a protector of Christians, the major threats to Christians in the United States are coming from Trump's own administration, because authoritarian theocracy does not serve the interests of Christians." And that tells you this isn't a battle between Christianity and secularism, but between democratic pluralism and authoritarian theocracy, between a vision of America, where people of all faiths and no faith coexist as equals, and a vision where one sect dominates through state power. The man you just watched dismissing all criticism and calmly explaining that he spent 4 years planning this moment is now implementing that plan with the full power of the federal government behind him. And if we don't mount immediate and sustained resistance at every level, if we don't match their sophistication and preparation with our own strategic vision, if we don't treat this as the existential threat it represents, then American democracy as we've known it may not survive this administration. And that's not hyperbole. That's the sober assessment of what Christian nationalism in power actually means when you cut through all the sanitizing rhetoric about religious liberty and traditional values and restoring America's Christian foundation.